The Kurdish forces have made it very clear that they will do everything they can to defend themselves. But how much of a fight can they put up against the Turkish troops, given that we have some numbers here, roughly 5,000 to 10,000 of them that had amassed on the border with Syria?
Well, the thing is, what's going to make a very big difference, obviously, is the equipment of the Turkish army. But I'd like to show you a map, because I always understand things much better with a map. So we have a map of this northern region of Syria. And indeed, you've got to understand what's at stake for the Kurds. The Kurds have been fighting this war against ISIS as a partner to the international coalition against the Islamic State for years now. They've had heavy losses, and indeed, in the course of this, they have managed to take control of a very large part of Syria. Basically, all this piece in yellow you see here. Now, the problem for the Kurds is that what the Turks are wanting to do, which is create this buffer zone here up north. This is something that Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been wanting to do for a very long time. But you see, all the main cities in Syrian Kurdistan are in the red here. If it were, France, for example, it would be as if you'd say, right, I'm just going to have a security zone that includes Paris, Lyon, Marseille and Bordeaux. If it's with the United States, it would be like saying, right, I'm going to cut a slice along the East Coast in which you will have Washington and New York. The Kurds, basically, if they lose that piece of land, will have nothing left. All they'll have is a large piece of desert. Now, there are cities a little bit lower, but what we're looking at here is mass exodus, should the Turks really move in strongly, to the south towards desert. And there, what you would have is potential large camps. Now, this has already happened once earlier. This was the Turkish operation called Olive Branch, and this was over here to the western side of the border. It's that piece that you can see here, which is turquoise. This is controlled now by the Turkish army and its allies, and that includes also some, jihadi groups. The city there, the main city there, is called Afrin, and indeed, when Afrin fell, the Americans did not move. The reason for that is that there was a kind of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, that this line here between the pink and the yellow, in fact, is the Euphrates River. And basically the idea was that the Kurds, and backed by the US, controlled everything northeast of the Euphrates River, and basically the regime controlled what was on the other side, the regime, the Russians, and the Iranians. So indeed, Turkey managed to take this part. But here, it's a different game. But by moving out, indeed, the US are leaving the Kurds, they're hanging them out to dry. And for having seen the Kurds fight, they're very good, they're very brave on the ground, but they do not have equipment. For example, they retook Raqqa. I went for France 24 to the Battle of Raqqa. They were using homemade armoured vehicles. Now, they had a few armoured vehicles that were given by the US, but they were relying heavily on airstrikes, all the air power from the US, drone strikes, helicopters, special forces, US, French, British, etc. They were relying on all that to manage to make advances against the Islamic State group. And you can't compare the Islamic State group's military tactics with Turkey. Turkey is a modern, fully fledged army. So it's impossible for them to resist. Let's face it, that's a fact.
James, speaking of the Islamic State group, we've just had news come in from Germany saying that they fear that this offensive by Turkey could essentially provoke or give space to the Islamic State group to reemerge again. We know that they made immense territorial losses. They were defeated. Is that possible?
Well, I'm afraid it is. It is very much,
There's a power vacuum, certainly.
It is what's going to happen. As I told you, this piece of territory here is, existential to Syrian Kurdistan. So what the Kurds are going to do is that they are also controlling, in this map, all this southern part, right? Even Raqqa. Raqqa is an Arab Sunni city. It is basically not natural terrain for the Kurds. And just to put things really clearly, you have attacks on a daily basis in Raqqa. People coming out of nowhere with Kalashnikovs, firing at Kurdish, militiamen holding neighborhoods, etc. You have bombs that go off on a daily basis in Raqqa. And for the moment, it's extremely difficult to assert control on Raqqa. Raqqa, once again, is not natural terrain for the Kurds. It is not their homeland. So what they will probably do, and this is what they've been threatening to do all along, is basically move their forces up north. They're not that interested in controlling Raqqa. The minute the Kurds leave Raqqa, Raqqa falls back into the hands of, the Islamic State, or a milder version of it, or a tougher version of it. Nobody knows. All the political problems in Raqqa are still there. What caused the emergence of the Islamic State is still there. You still have disgruntled Sunni communities that are marginalized and who are now living in a totally destroyed city. So the potential for violence here is immense, and you can go down here along the Euphrates River, you get to Deir ez-Zor region. That's exactly the same. When I visited that at the end of 2018, and they were retaking it, they were having a tough time with the population simply because there's, people look at each other. The population is majorly Sunni. A lot of these people were anyway suspected by the Kurds of having helped the Islamic State group. The fact of the matter is, they did. So it's very difficult for them to keep control there. And if they move up, well, Islamic State will most certainly come back into that vacuum.
And staying with the Islamic State, James, we know that actually their prisoners are in the area. What's going to happen to them?
Well, the prisoners in the area, they are, for example, this is Al-Hol camp, right? We were there with the team of France 24. That was the beginning of this year. And so there are several thousand prisoners, some of them local. If you take the local ones into account, we're talking tens of thousands. There are also several thousands of foreign jihadi fighters that are being held by the Kurds, by the Syrian Democratic Forces, obviously with help of Western powers who bring in money or means, etc. But the conditions are pretty dire, for example, in our whole camp. And, well, I don't know if we have this piece of footage, but I can show you. OK, I'm sorry, I'm being told we do not have the piece of footage, so never mind. But anyway, we're talking basically a camp which looks like a refugee camp in which women and children are just parked. That's something that we filmed. We went in there. And at the stage we did go, the situation was already difficult, with one person having been stabbed by these women and killed, and they found the body under a tent. Now, things have gone into the next gear, if you will, since, and that is that there's been a fully fledged rebellion inside the camp, where at one stage they managed to put up a flag for the Islamic State group. Other Kurdish guards have been killed, and the Kurds have been saying all along, and they told us, look, this is not our problem, if you will. They're saying, right, please, European countries, come back and collect these people. It's not our job to take care of them. They've come, they destroyed our country, and now we're supposed to keep them, endlessly for you. And Donald Trump has been going on about that as well. But the fact of the matter is, France, Germany, because we saw French people, German people, we saw people from northern countries, etc. There were many, many nationalities, and we're talking thousands of people. These were just the women. The men are kept separately, and they're not shown easily to journalists. And basically, we didn't meet any of the men. But the countries don't want them back, because obviously it's a major threat, as we've seen in Paris just recently.
James, we've been talking about how high the stakes are for the Kurdish forces, essentially why Turkey started this offensive. You've been talking about the potential re-emergence of the Islamic State group. What about the civilians? They happen to be at the heart of any conflict, and already we've been seeing images of them escaping, fleeing the area with their basic possessions on their backs. Let's not forget the civilians.
Well, for the civilians, it's going to be very difficult. It depends what Turkey decides to do. When Turkey moved into Afrin, 300,000 people were displaced. And the idea of the Turks, and this is what they've been selling as well, is to move the Syrian refugees who fled conflict to Turkey back into Syria, in part in this area. Now, it's very difficult to imagine how that would be done. But anyway, it is something that Erdogan says, basically, either you let us take a piece of Syria to put these people back into Syria, or we're going to just open the gates and let them back into Europe. This is also why he's getting away with a lot of the stuff he's doing right now. So the question is, yes, the civilians, they are obviously extremely tense and frightened. I've been able to speak to a couple of people who are telling me, well, they don't exactly know what to do yet. As you've heard, the YPG, the Syrian Democratic Forces, but you could say YPG now, is saying, right, we need to all fight together. It is important to remember that the YPG is also a Marxist guerrilla, and that, yes, indeed, they might mobilize everybody. But, yes, the potential damage is huge, and what we're really facing is basically people moving down south from this part, which is densely populated, which is full of towns, into the desert, and that means tents, and that means big problems, because we're talking a lot of people. If you take a city like Kamishli, it is a large city. If you take you know, along that border is where all the population is concentrated. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of people who will be displaced.
If they don't stick to that 100-kilometre radius, essentially, and go beyond, right?
Well, it's less than 100 kilometres. We're talking maybe 25, 30. Well, it's basically what Erdogan has been wanting since the beginning.
To break down the infrastructure. James,